Hello, good evening. Thank you all for coming. And thank you also to Bob Purcell and the Haffenreffer Museum for inviting me to give this talk today. This is material that I haven't been able to focus on recently because I've been in the world of iron. And so I'm happy for this opportunity to get back to it. So what I'd like to talk about today is explore a little bit about what happens in a museum between visitors on the one hand and exhibits on the other. A lot of my thinking about this has been spurred by my consideration of museums and exhibits in a variety of contexts, both here and abroad. Specifically, it was observing the encounters of other visitors that led me to think about what was, or seemed to be, happening in galleries and therefore in museums in general. One implication of looking at these issues is that it shows us how people are using museums and therefore helps us to understand what museums are for, potentially from a visitor's perspective, and also what they can be. Okay, so what happens in museums? Actually quite a lot. In public areas of museums, there is socializing, eating, drinking, talking, shopping. There are classes, tours, activities of various kinds. Visitors engage in many activities that may, at one point, have seemed to be beyond the function of a museum, although today, these are an expected and integral part of the museum-going experience for most people. Indeed, people might even go to museums on outings in which the exhibits are peripheral or simply a background for other social interactions. For example, on a rainy day, you want to spend some time, go to a museum, right, with a friend, colleague, a spouse, partner, etc. Amid all of this, however, there are still the exhibits with artifacts on display, the reason for the existence of the museum, and the ostensible reason, at least, for the visit to the museum. And here I would like to note that although there are some types of museums without collections on display, for example, certain types of science museums, and the News Museum, the Newseum down in Washington, D.C., my interest here is in those instances where we do have objects or artifacts on display. Museums generally are places where people engage with a variety of objects, organized into displays, and through them, with aspects of the past and the present, with the familiar and the foreign. The basic idea is that visitors to museums learn about aspects of the world through objects on display, or more specifically, through the exhibits that have been constructed by museum professionals to convey information or ideas about the subject matter at hand. When scholars and researchers have considered the nature of museums, the focus has most often been on analyzing exhibits, or analyzing the exhibits. For example, they've investigated the history of exhibit-making strategies, often focusing on either the explicit or implicit messages embedded in such exhibits. When exploring the effectiveness of museums, the focus has been on whether visitors have learned what museum professionals have intended as the relevant content for a particular exhibit. In other words, the interaction in the museum has been understood as primarily a flow of information from the museum, from museum professionals, or from the institution, mediated through the exhibits to the museum goer, who either gets the information or doesn't. Indeed, in most cases, the construction of the message or the interpretation of information is understood to be linked to the creation of the exhibit, with the effectiveness of the display gauged by how well the museum goers learn from it. Similarly, even when focusing more explicitly on visitor experiences, the concern has tended to focus on how well they learn, how well these visitors learn through the exhibits, and what kinds of factors might impact that learning. For example, issues of identity, accessibility, legibility, among others. It is undoubtedly the case that such learning does happen in museum contexts. But what I would like to broach here is the possibility that it is not the only way to understand what happens. Specifically, I want to focus here more on what visitors bring to this interaction and how that might impact their experiences of museums. People encounter museum exhibits not in isolation, but in conjunction with already formed views of the world that they bring in with them. For example, researchers at the Smithsonian Institution, specifically Zahava Daring and Andrew Pekarik, have posited that rather than being blank slates, quote unquote, visitors engage with exhibits using what these researchers call an entrance narrative. That is, this narrative is something that each visitor brings with them, with him or her, into a museum. There's no need for them to be conscious of this narrative, which has three components. It includes the ways in which the visitor understands the world, his or her knowledge about the specific topic at hand, and the personal experiences that work to reinforce this particular way of understanding the world. These scholars argue that when we want to understand what visitors get out of the exhibits, whether they are learning what they're quote-unquote supposed to be learning, understanding the broader themes or messages encoded within these exhibits, or even learning new things as a result of attending exhibits, we need to account for these entrance narratives. Indeed, they argue that some museum messages are going to be more effective because they resonate with these narratives, while other messages might be ignored or actively challenged because they contradict those same narratives. In this way, museum goers become more active participants in any potential transmission of knowledge or information, and therefore in the functioning of the museum. So, what may have once been conceived of as a lecture is perhaps better envisioned as a specific type of dialogue, one that cannot take place in real time because it's not a true dialogue, since exhibits are not reconfigured based on visitors' responses. But it's not simply a lecture either. Visitors are not passive recipients of information or ideas. Indeed, there are many attempts to make visitors more active learners, as we see that exhibits increasingly seek to engage them in some type of dialogue by providing them with the means to talk back to exhibits, as it were. For example, by leaving notes, by using message boards, or engaging in activities that are a part of the exhibit experience. What these opportunities do is tap into the dynamic between the entrance narratives and the content of the displays, especially those exhibits that are seen to be more conducive to debate and discussion. However, what I propose here is that this dynamic exists in most, if not all, encounters within the museum setting. So what I'd like to do here is use this idea of an entrance narrative, or more generally, the idea that people enter museums or engage with exhibits in conjunction with already formed views of the world, and very often with other people along, to more closely examine their interactions in a way that broadens our understanding of how museum goers might be actively constructing and framing what museums are all about. And to do this, I'll be using a series of observations in and about museums as springboards for various sections of the discussion that follows. So, my first observation actually deals with my first visit to the National Museum of the American Indian, soon after it opened in Washington, D.C. I was there with my father, and as we were about to enter the exhibit galleries, we watched a short video greeting which welcomed us and explained in general terms, or in more detailed terms, sorry, what is basically highlighted on the screen there, right? The person in the video explained that what we were about to see was American history from the perspective of Native American peoples. That this might differ from other versions of history that we might encounter in other museums, for example, other museums on the Mall, and that we should adopt a critical stance towards what we were about to see and hear so that we could evaluate these competing versions of history. Right? I was impressed and very happy, right, with this kind of contextualization, contextualizing these exhibits and even a whole museum, right, and foregrounding the fact that it is a constructed vision, right, like all museums are, right, and so at last we're getting somewhere where somebody's actually engaging with the public, engaging about the whole process of museum and exhibit making. There were other people in that little alcove, in addition to us, but I hadn't really paid much attention to them. As we all turned to leave, one of them commented to her friend, or the person that she was with, that what we were then about to see was propaganda, i.e. it was biased. I should not have been surprised at this reaction, looking back on it. Not as any judgment on those people, on those individuals, but as an acknowledgement that our collective understanding and expectations of what we encounter in museums should somehow be the objective truth, right? Or at least an objective representation of reality. More fundamentally, there's an expectation that the artifacts on display, whether archaeological, ethnographic, artistic, or even paleontological, all refer in some discernible fashion to the world out there, right? To the real world. They should represent an objective reality, again, of that world out there. Such an expectation can be traced to the history of museums, which emerged as a part of the Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment European intellectual tradition. One strand of this history encompasses early cabinets of curiosity, which were filled with odd, rare, or unusual bits of the material world. And here we see a representation of Ole Worm's cabinet, the Musée Wormiana, from an etching from 1655. These objects were gathered, either first or second hand, and then arranged by the creator of the cabinet. Although meant to be didactic, the arrangement reflected the creator's aesthetic sensibilities, understanding of natural history, in the broadest sense of that term, and his familiarity with the convention of cabinets. For example, the fact that aquatic creatures go on the roof, right, are up high. And when viewed with the norms of modern museums in mind, what these cabinets do not have was a rational organizational scheme. Although filled with parts of the real world, they reflect the ideas of the individual creator rather than the modern conceptions or modern categories of reality that we use to organize contemporary museums and contemporary knowledge more generally. Therefore, when viewed by people habituated to modern museum norms and standards, these objects just don't belong together. They belong variously in art, natural history, archaeology, or ethnography museums, but definitely not all together in one room. At maybe different rooms in the same building, but not all together. Despite the fact that significant scholarship about the history of museums has compellingly shown that what is often presented as neutral or objective has in fact been shaped by historical processes, such as disparate formation and acquisition of collections, unequal access to artifacts, and by curatorial visions, even if those visions, like here, emphasized a certain type of empirical reality or even objectivity, there persists this assumption and expectation on the part of the visitor of neutrality or objectivity. That what we see in the exhibits are reflections of reality that are unmediated by individual or institutional histories and therefore unbiased. For example, I wonder if the person that I overheard at the NMAI would have or did have the same reaction or make those similar comments in the Museum of American History or any other museum that did not foreground the process of museum or exhibit making. I acknowledge that this expectation might differ based on the type of museum in question and whether we're talking about permanent galleries or traveling exhibitions or even special exhibits. For example, more interpretation might be expected and tolerated in an art museum, especially in special exhibits whose curators are often very prominent as the creators of the exhibit. However, this is still often distinct from how art in the permanent galleries is presented. Without such prominent curatorial voices making decisions about organization and about who or what belongs in an art museum, it can seem as if museums objectively reflect the art of the world, or a subset of it, and therefore reflect an uncontested reality. To the contrary, we know, for example, that the art canon has been the result of active choices and decisions by individuals and institutions, as was discussed actually here in one of these lectures by Chris Steiner earlier this semester. Over the course of the history of the museum as an institution, as it became more formalized and institutionalized, it also came to be seen as an authoritative and legitimate representation of the world. Right? And interestingly, this ability to confer legitimacy has been exported, if you will, to global contexts, where we see, for example, museums serving as legitimators of post-colonial nation states, communities, and identities. Museums, as institutions, have also engendered a way of seeing, understanding, and behaving. Within exhibits, visitors' gazes are trained on artifacts that are displayed in ways that invite sustained and focused viewing, often without contextual features or information, but organized according to some comprehensible framework or frameworks. Furthermore, there has emerged a way of being in museums, certain behaviors that are expected and that are enacted. A museum way of attending to objects, of reading labels, talking in whispers, of hushed tones and sedate behavior. Part of being in a museum is behaving as if you are in a museum. The importance of these museological characteristics for visitors: objectivity, rationality, the ability to comprehend the organizing principles of the exhibits, and the ability to move through the museum as appropriate museum goers, is highlighted when these characteristics are absent. One such site, a site of disruption, as it has been called, is the Museum of Jurassic Technology. It's almost impossible to describe what this museum is, and people have tried, many people. It is a collection of objects that is housed in a building in Culver City, California. So it does exist, it's real, it has a physical presence. It purports to offer us a glimpse of life in the lower Jurassic. As you can see here, this is, again, a blurb from its introduction page. Interestingly, if you continue the introduction, it gives a short but relatively accurate overview of the development of museums from cabinets of curiosity. So it does subscribe to that particular heritage, if you will. Its galleries are designed not to accommodate large groups. It is dimly lit, and the layout is not linear or clearly explained anywhere. Right. It contains, amongst other things, descriptions of bats captured in lead walls several feet thick, up here on the left. And lead had to be used apparently because the bats can pass through other materials, a version of sonar unique to this South American bat. A display of micro miniature carvings that fit inside the eye of needles, the horn of Mary Davis sawgull, and the Cameroonian stink ant. Visitors rarely know what to make of this place because it challenges so many norms about what a museum should be like and what it should do, starting obviously with the name, Jurassic Technology. It is a cabinet of curiosities in many ways, and this might be precisely why visitors feel disoriented, especially if they approach it with the expectation of encountering a traditional museum. Like cabinets of curiosities, there seems to be an attempt to represent the empirical world. But this is not organized according to categories that are recognizable today. What we would classify as ethnographic artifacts sit side by side with geological and biological specimens and with pieces of art. Indeed, it's difficult to ascertain what is actually quote unquote real here and what may be quote unquote fake. The language of authority is used in a way that leaves people unsure about the authenticity of what they are seeing. For example, does something like the stink ant really exist? There's slippage in how it's described. A lot of detail, yet somehow unconvincing, that leaves many visitors unsure. The use of genus and species names, for example, is real but not real. There's an extra syllable in that genus name. Right? There is actually a stink ant. This actually does happen, apparently, or something like this. Right? But it's not completely accurate, nor is it completely wrong. Right? And hence the disorientation and the confusion of the visitors. In this admittedly extreme case, visitors are forced to become explicitly active in the ordering of their experience at this museum. The exhibits are constantly being remade by the visitors themselves because they get no help from the Museum of Jurassic Technology. There are no maps, there are no guidebooks, there's no pamphlet, nothing explaining the overall schema, what brings all of these together and what kind of order keeps them all together. What each person or group of people makes of the museum depends to a great extent on what they expect and what they bring with them. In other words, their entrance narratives. Whether people leave feeling exhilarated or angry depends on how flexible their conception of museum is, or indeed whether, despite the name, they encounter this phenomenon as a museum, or as an art installation, or as something else. as an aside, I have actually been here, and for me, stability came when I connected it explicitly with a cabinet of curiosity. There's an exhibit in here devoted to Athanasius Kircher, who's one of the early creators of a cabinet for the Jesuits. I was then able to appreciate the sense of anything being possible that animated early cabinets, right? The sense of we never know what's out there and all of this is possible, right? Because we don't yet know that it is impossible. The person I was with, however, wanted to get out of there, did not like this at all, right? There was not enough order, not enough of a comprehensible framework. Although there are a number of ways in which we can investigate this institution or phenomenon, for my purposes here, what I want to highlight is the strength of that entrance narrative. In this case, many visitors' reactions emphasize their ideas of what a museum should be doing and how it should be laid out. It highlights how strong the museum paradigm is, and the emphasis on being able to read a comprehensible story of the world or some aspect of it through objects. So when we get back to the visitors at the NMAI, we can see the expectations of objectivity as being part of a larger paradigm that sees these institutions as repositories of objective information, and also as an example of how we as visitors have been trained to be in and think about museums. When that expectation is challenged, we are disoriented, and unless we can and do call upon alternate frames of understanding, we might leave confused at best, or feeling duped at worst, which is apparently has been the reaction of some visitors to the Museum of Jurassic Technology, feeling like they were taken in. The tension between visitor expectations and what they encounter is a part of the story, but not all of it. What I've just discussed fits with the notion of the museum as a place of learning, where the generation of content is by the museum and the learning is done by the visitor. What I want to do now is turn to other types of engagements with exhibits, where we don't necessarily see such challenges, but where there is the potential for visitors to be part of the content generating process. I'll begin with two more observations that I hope will illustrate some of what I'm going to be talking about. Immediately prior to my visit to the NMAI, my father and I were at the Air and Space Museum, which is right next door. One of the reasons this particular visit to DC has stayed with me, is the contrast that I observed in visitors' behavior between the Air and Space and the National Museum of the American Indian. The Air and Space was boisterous, and what was really striking was the fact that there seemed to be very little of the accepted museum behavior going on. Most of the visitors were not, as far as I could tell, paying much attention to the labels or any of the information contained within the exhibits. Indeed, I don't really recall doing much reading of anything myself. Mostly I talked with my father, and this is what most of the other visitors were doing. This does not mean, however, that the exhibits were being ignored. Rather, they were the focus of a lot of discussion within the groups. Viewing the displays was very much a group activity with little individual viewing. In contrast, visitors were much quieter at the NMAI. They were more focused on displays and on reading the information. And even if visiting the museum in a group or as part of a group, they viewed displays individually. Similarly, at the Chhatrapati Shivaji Museum in Mumbai, formerly known as the Prince of Wales Museum, there was a contrast in the type of engagement with objects on display between Indian and non-Indian visitors. And I should probably acknowledge that my assessment of Indian and non-Indian was incredibly superficial and based on visual inspection. Non-Indians were those who were obviously tourists, right? Backpacks and et cetera. And Indians were the others. So yes, I acknowledge that. So while the non-Indians, almost to a person, engaged in standard museological behavior, or at least what we understand as such, by attending to artifacts, reading the labels and the information placards, and usually as individuals, the Indians were more often in groups and less prone to actually reading the labels. Rather, there was more targeted interaction with specific objects, which were then discussed to a lesser or greater extent among the members of the group. This difference in museum behavior between the Indians and non-Indians might be accounted for by the different culture of museums in each place. There are obviously different sets of behaviors that are appropriate in different places, and the habit or habitus of museum going might be very different in the US and in India. However, if that is so, then how do we explain the Air and Space Museum? For within the US, there are also markedly different behaviors that seem appropriate in different museums, or even in different galleries of the same museum. I suggest that one way to think about this variation is to locate one side of content production not with the museum, but with the visitors, or perhaps more precisely, at a point between the visitor and the exhibit or artifact on display. The artifacts act as devices that trigger information in the form of stories, memories, or other ideas that are then shared between the members of the group, perhaps families, perhaps friends, and perhaps across generations. Therefore, what is being learned here, if learning is the correct term, is framed by the museums and exhibits, but is not necessarily the same as the information content of those exhibits. The objects trigger the stories and therefore the learning or sharing, but the content and interpretation in the discussions comes from the visitors. Obviously, those artifacts on display are somehow meaningful, which is why they are on display. They are more than mere physical objects. They carry meaning and elicit responses. But as meaningful objects, they are also beyond the complete or sole control of curators or other museum professionals. While there may be one set of information or ideas that is presented by the museum, at the Chhatrapati Shivaji Museum, it is an art historical paradigm in which artifacts on display are labeled according to style, date, and provenience, for example. There seems to be another one that is being created by visitors, some of whom seem completely uninterested in the one proffered by the institution. Furthermore, I would argue that what we are seeing here is not an acceptance or rejection of the museum's narrative because of conformity with or divergence from the entrance narratives of the visitors. Rather, it is the creation of something separate, where the assignment of meaning is the visitor's prerogative. Indeed, the role of the institution, the museum, in mediating meaning is sometimes outright rejected, as has been documented actually at several Indian heritage sites. The learning then is done by visitors from other visitors as these stories or information are constructed and exchanged. So then if meaning is constructed between the visitor and the exhibit, then pre-existing relationships between the two then become very relevant. In the case of the Shivaji Museum in Mumbai, the pre-existing relationships between many, but not all, of the Indian visitors and the objects on display, especially sculptural elements, allowed them to create their own content about what they were seeing, which may or may not have coincided with what the museum was presenting. Presumably, this may have been something that the non-Indians were unable to do. Looking at other museums, we can see a combined emphasis on the entrance narrative so that the worldviews, information, and experiences of the visitors are explicitly acknowledged and even addressed. However, as these institutions do so, they also seem to challenge some of our collective notions of what a museum should be. Those ideas that underpinned the discussions of the NMAI, or the Museum of Jurassic Technology. Learning, objectivity, and connection to the empirical world no longer seem to be as central. One such museum, relatively newly opened, is the Creation Museum in Kentucky, which aims to bring the Bible to life. And I should note that I have not yet visited it, and therefore have not had the opportunity to observe visitor behavior. So most of my information comes from thinking about the exhibits as presented on the website. The existence of this museum and the nature of its exhibits are both fascinating. I mean, I am fascinated by this museum, and also relevant to my discussion here. First, there's obviously a specific assumed background for the visitors and an assumed relationship between the visitors and the content of the exhibits. The museum is predicated on specific entrance narratives. There does not seem to be any contextualization. For example, situating what we see here within other creation accounts or other religions that would help people who are not familiar with Christianity to fully understand what is presented. The privileging of the experiences and information that the expected visitors are expected to bring with them in many ways seems to allow a disconnection with the broader world, or with accepted notions of objectivity, and ostensibly breaking some of the fundamental rules of being a museum. Yet, that is the question, a fascinating question. Why a museum? Why not a center? Why not a library? Or some other type of educational institution, or even another type of institution? Why a museum, especially if some of the fundamental rules are going to be broken? Although there is no explicit contextualization or explanation for the existence of such a museum, that is, no explanation why a museum focused on the Christian creation story might be necessary, and why that explanation of it, or that presentation of such the story, needs to take place within the context of a museum, it does implicitly engage with broader debates within some parts of our society about the nature of the human past. The desire to engage in and legitimize a position within that debate might help explain the choice of this institution actually being presented or designed as a museum. For here, I would argue, we see the power of objects and the power of a museum. The narrative put forth in these exhibits can be understood to be bolstered through the use of material displays and reconstructions. And equally fascinating, because of what it says about the power, and it is equally fascinating because because of what it says about the power and the legitimizing force of museums, at least in our society. What we see happening here is the explicit acknowledgement of the entrance narratives of the visitors and the legitimization of those narratives through their presentation in a museum setting. Indeed, if we take a look at the exhibit halls, we see the conventions of museum presentation, such as labels, reconstructions, the use of questions to engage visitors in dialogue, as well as the authoritative voice that is presenting and interpreting ideas for visitors. In many ways, this is an exemplar of what a museum should be, in direct contrast to, and pretty much the opposite of what the Museum of Jurassic Technology was, which in many ways people have said is exactly what a museum should not be. All of this speaks to and resonates with visitors who are familiar with the idea of museums and with the museum way of learning. Their narratives, their entrance narratives, are not challenged, and they leave with those ideas reinforced, right? And this is precisely because they've met with those ideas and re-met with them within the context of a museum, right? Which ideally is this objective representation of a reality beyond the walls of the museum, right? But what if there is no authoritative voice? And what if the learning, if there is any, is about the self and not about the world? I will very briefly touch upon a final museum to highlight some of these ideas. Another new museum, which moved into its permanent facilities in 2010, is the Museum of Broken Relationships in Zagreb, Croatia. And again, I have not yet visited this one. It is a museum formed around the detritus of failed relationships. Although the founders of the museum organize the material and therefore present an ordered exhibit, and although the objects come from the world out there, the point of visiting this museum is not to learn about the world, but to undergo a form of catharsis or empathetic understanding. The museum was initially, and continues to be, conceived of as an art exhibit. The core of the collection was formed by the founders' mementos of their failed relationship and the mementos of friends' broken relationships. And they also solicit donations from the community at large. And for example, the donation period for the Amsterdam exhibition has been extended. Right? So this is the curators, the founders, exercise some sort of discretionary discretion over what is exhibited, and they have about 100 objects on display at any given moment. Right? But it is primarily the the objects on display are primarily these solicited collections, private collections. However, there is no broader canon to which the objects on display refer. They are not meant to teach us about the many ways in which people deal with breakups. Right? Rather, they are meant to reach those experiences in each visitor's life that are similar or that resonate. In this way, it is similar to the Creation Museum. The entrance narrative is the key component that is explicitly being engaged here. But what, if anything, is being learned? And should that make a difference? Especially when this museum seems to be very popular and very effective. And indeed, the museum won an award for being innovative and for challenging common perceptions of the role of museums. Right? So we can ask whether what happens in museums is learning, only learning, or something else, or learning and something else. Right? And this museum seems to argue for saying that it's something else that's happening in museums and in a museum setting. So where does this get us? What can we make of these various exhibits or museums and the varied ways in which people engage with these exhibits? Museums are places where we learn, but they are also places where we reinforce our understanding of the world, reconstruct existing paradigms. Obviously, not all museums are the same, and we wouldn't expect them to be. But they are different not simply in terms of their content, but also in terms of the behaviors or reactions elicited by their exhibits. These reactions, engagements or lack thereof, stem as much from what the visitors bring into the museum with them as from what is on display. Or more precisely, they result from the interaction between what visitors bring with them and what is on display. And as we have seen, it can be quite effective to explicitly address those entrance narratives of the visitors. But visitors are different. We all know this. There's been an extensive discussion about the representations of various communities, for example, Native Americans, African Americans, probably most prominently, both within the world of the museum professional and in the exhibits themselves, and about how to create exhibits that will speak to and engage with them. This is an important corrective to unequal histories in and out of museums. And in fact, thinking about how to best address these concerns has improved our understanding of how exhibits work. But just as we can think of members of these and other communities as having differential relationships with various types of museums and exhibits, so can we think of most museum goers. In fact, there may be very few people who behave as a normative museum goer, i.e., as an attentive learner, in all contexts. The same individuals might behave very differently in different museums, moving through one as learners and through another as co-creators of content. And incorporating this into how we envision what happens in museums and what museums are for might help us to take them in some interesting directions. Thank you.
Thank you for being able to take a few questions.
Sure, of course. Yes, Peter.
This may go a little beyond the scope of your presentation, but I've noticed an almost unprecedented proliferation of museums in recent years, and yet my impression of the younger generation is that a lot of them are more concerned with virtual reality than what my generation considers to be reality.
Right.
I'm wondering whether you see the virtual museum in the future threatening the existence of real museums.
There are two things I would like to address there. The first is to answer your question, no, I don't. I think there is something still very powerful about the material object that draws us, right? And so in my engagement with and interaction with students, right, that the younger generation, this comes out loud and clear, right? Especially if you try to ask them, for example, are they okay looking at fakes in a museum, right? A reproduction David as opposed to the real one. They're not, right? And so that material, that object with its own cultural biography is still incredibly powerful, right? So I think maybe what will happen is the virtual will complement the, right? But what I actually also think might happen, what that shows is the kind of redefining of what we mean by museum, right? That in the virtual world and in the real world, this proliferation of museums is taking us in a different direction, maybe away from this overtly didactic model to something else, right? Where it is maybe much more about interaction, much more about what that Museum of Broken Relationships was about, right? Apparently that's incredibly popular. 40,000 people a year go visit that museum, right? So that's what I see happening. Yeah.
So this talk actually made me think of the Constitution Museum, the USS Constitution Museum in Boston.
Okay.
They're a family learning project, so they're redesigning a lot of their exhibits around trying to make them foster interaction between parents and children or grandparents and children. The kind of thing you're talking about at the Space Museum.
Right.
And it's really fun, but it also has the effect, I guess, of not being appealing to people with, I guess, the more traditional museum-going expectations. So I guess what are your thoughts on aiming towards specific audiences versus trying to please everyone? Is that possible?
Right. I don't know if it's, and this is actually something I've been thinking about for the past day, you know, because that's one of the implications of this. What can we do? And is it possible to create that kind of general experience that pleases everybody? And I'm not sure that it would be, right? Especially if we want to get different kinds of people into museums, right? We want different communities, different groups of people, getting them in. And what occurred to me was what might actually work better is rather than having subject matter oriented museums, right, as like the Constitution, to reframe that as something else. I'm not sure what the other thing would be, but maybe more of a theme or a question, something like that. So you're still talking about the Constitution, but in a different way. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. Other questions?
We visited the Natural History Museum in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And we were going through the northwest coast and frozen in time.
Yes.
I don't know, 1920s, 1930s.
Yeah.
Earlier. I don't know. I mean, I love seeing the objects, and I know something about some of the objects,
Mm-hmm.
textiles and so forth. But you don't get a sense of the people. I mean, you see what this thing is.
Right.
People are missing and could really be enhanced, I guess, by a virtual museum. You know,
Right.
telling you more. Right? I mean, we don't have a thing that could go.
Right.
But you could go on and find out more about these sub-tribes that, you know, the names are unfamiliar as opposed to the larger ones. But frozen.
Yes, a lot of those galleries are, right? And to change them would take a lot of money and effort. And
Both brothers have
pardon?
it. Both brothers have it.
Right. In lieu of that, or awaiting that, but that's where something like the virtual might actually be quite effective, right? Especially because there's also this train of thought or school of thought that says, but those exhibits now are, it's a museum of a museum, right? It's actually how things, you know, if you want to go see kind of 1940s representations of the natural world, right? As problematic as those representations were, it's actually, you know, as you say, a time capsule. And so something like a virtual component would address those issues and might actually make it more relevant. Yeah.
A comment. One of the most pleasing museums, the most pleasing museums I go into are those that have audio guides. It seems to me a relatively inexpensive way
Mm-hmm.
to, I think the comment was made over here that there's so many items that you see that you can't, it's hard to understand them and to get their framework in the context of what is going on next to them. But audio guides are relatively inexpensive, aren't they?
I think so.
Depending on
Yeah.
the size of the institution, but you certainly can adapt it periodically to
Mhm.
what changes take place.
Yes. So that would be a much more flexible and malleable component,
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah. Hi.
How are you?
Good.
What he was saying with audio guides, I was thinking, I went to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum recently,
Mhm.
and they had these maps, north wall, south wall, east wall, of what was on each wall, because they had multiple paintings on each wall. And I love going to museums, but I have to say, everybody that was in there was taking the maps and kind of just throwing them around, because it was so complicated to read, because they had 15 things on a wall, and trying to find out which wall was exactly north and which one was south was like the biggest
Right.
thing. And he said all you guys are a great way, but like, do you think there's something else that they could do that would be better for, like making things other than these?
Right.
Like, they're too small to put
Yeah.
little blurbs underneath each one, and there's too many, and you
Mhm.
kind of can't appreciate it if you don't know.
Yeah, and with the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, I also don't know what they can do, right? Because I know that they've put that new edition on, but they're also constrained by the terms of the bequest or the endowment. They're very much like the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, right? And the Barnes also does the same thing. They're little things that oh, that's what those are, right? So there are those constraints that apply to that particular museum that aren't relevant, that aren't at play elsewhere. But I was talking with somebody earlier about rather than actually having physical maps, right, to have virtual maps of some sort, right, an app or something like that, where it's on your smartphone, you're not taking somebody else's, right? So and that might, and I think those might also be a little bit more. You can, with the compass, which one's the north wall, something like that might help.